Hey everyone, welcome to the next few videos of your lecture series, in particular to dealing with ATP production. Okay, these are going to be really important when we cover the three different energy generating systems or ATP producing systems of the body. The first one we're going to cover is ATP Pc or phosphocreatine system. The next one will be glycolysis, and the last one will be our aerobic system. Okay, but we'll get to that in the next chapter. Okay, so we're going to deal with two in the anaerobic system right now. So the first one, ATP Pc. And if you followed up this lecture with the last one, you would have seen that last slide where predominantly there's three wedges of the pie showing what happens in a 3-second bout of activity. So let's say a vertical jump. Okay, that's 3 seconds or less. Now, two of those wedges were the largest. One was the phosphocreatine, and again, I've brought up that word a few times, so we know that's anaerobic with the ATP Pc system. But ATP, how is that integrated, and why is that part of this system? Well, let's dive into that, answer that question, and look a little bit more at this anaerobic means of producing energy for our bodies. Okay, so with our ATP Pc system, stands for adenosine triphosphate phosphocreatine. Okay, so that's important to know as well. Helps explain what's going on. And as I mentioned before, it's used for quick, short, high force production type activities. So short in duration, sorry. So short amount of time, high level of intensity. So some examples of that would be shot put, 40-meter dash. Again, anything where the activity is kind of an all-out effort for about 30 seconds. In the lab section, we'll be covering something called a Wingate test, and that lasts about 30 seconds of all-out activity. Prime example for this, okay? So the way we have energy, if you can picture your classic image of a cell, a round cell, nucleus in the middle, all our little organelles. The way a lot of those cells get energy is through ADP. We know that. It's the only way. But sometimes we'll have this energy currency, this molecule of ATP, just free floating in the cell, so in the cytoplasm, or more in particular, if we're thinking about movement, in the what's called sarcoplasm, so muscle plasm of the muscle cells. And so there's not a large amount of it. So if you need a lot of energy, immediately we rely on this kind of molecule called phosphocreatine. Okay, and we'll take a look at that structure in a moment. And one of the things that's great about this is also it floats around kind of in the sarcoplasm or cytoplasm of our muscle cells, and it breaks into two kind of pieces. And again, with that high energy bond, let's just take a look. So here we have our creatine and our inorganic phosphate. Don't worry about the definition of inorganic too much. We think it might be a little confusing. Essentially, it's just saying it's a molecule of phosphate with some oxygens around it. In the state. So with this high energy bond here, again, we've seen that already in our ATP molecule. It's very similar. So when phosphocreatine splits, again, you get that release of energy. And from that release of energy, we can pair that up to lop on and anabolically add on add on another phosphate group, so we get ATP, right? So you take ADP, add a phosphate or hydrogen, we make ATP. When creatine phosphate essentially hydrolyzes it or breaks apart. So this high energy bond, again, just to be really redundant about that, is where our energy comes from to take ADP to turn it into ATP. I'm going to flow through that one more time, just so no one's lost here. So free floating in the cytoplasm, we have creatine phosphate with this high energy bond. That high energy bond gets broken, And this energy used from here, this bond, again, releases some energy, gets kind of like scooped up by ADP and a phosphate group, and essentially makes ATP. Now the cell can use ATP. So again, we're still in that 30 seconds of energy production or demand, like high intensity. It'll break down probably fairly quickly to ADP and phosphate again. But then if we have another creatine phosphate fly in, releases energy, the phosphate gets attached to the ADP again, and so we have new energy stored. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. That kind of flow between, again, the structure of a creatine molecule and a phosphate and getting broken there. Okay. So what does happen when our body gets depleted of phosphocreatine? Well, when depletion occurs, we have to then turn to some of our other energy systems. Okay, so this is kind of the first of three for the shortest duration, highest intensity kind of activities. Once it gets depleted, we need to turn to our aerobic generating system for ATP, or production system of ATP. Okay, so we haven't really spoke about glycolysis yet, but it would be kind of an intermediary on the way to using purely or primarily aerobic production of ATP. Okay, so this I think is a really good illustration when you think of interval training. So for example, you get this big burst of 10, 30 seconds of activity, and then you take a rest period in between. You know, if you think of resistance training or strength training, if you think of sprint training for track, any of these activities require this big short-term burst of high-intensity activity, and then you get like a 5-minute break in between your lifting sets, or 3 minutes in between your running sets, that sort of thing. Those are example numbers, but they're ballparkish. Okay, and during that time, our aerobic system is able to generate energy at a replenishing rate for us. Okay, so you know, if you're thinking about activities and you're like, okay, well, when I'm running, let's say 500 meters or let's say 5K, 5 kilometers or something like that, you know, or maybe for some of us, it's even a shorter. If, you know, maybe we're not trained in running, we go out and very, very quickly, like within a minute, we just feel completely taxed. We're tired, we've slowed down in our pace, so our output is slow, the amount of force that we can produce is much lower. What's happening there? Is that depletion of Atp Pc system? Well, yes, but it's not the primary reason to why you're feeling fatigue or why there's a decrease in force. It's not the actual ATP and phosphocreatine molecules themselves that are completely depleted. What's more likely happening is the environment in and around these molecules. So as ATP Pc, as the phosphocreatine molecule tends to not be able to keep pace and stuff, or through the rate of hydrolysis, and we'll go back to the reaction in a moment, this is going to help illustrate this, we get increased acidity in the cell because there's more hydrogen protons in the area, and there's also more phosphate molecules, that inorganic phosphate molecule I was talking about earlier, floating around the cell. The consequence of that is, like we spoke a few lectures ago, is the pH levels of the cell change, and therefore change how well the cell can work. And that's where we get our decreases in force and fatigue from. So let's just pop back here for a second. So if we're using a lot of ATP and using a lot of creatine phosphate, it doesn't mean those molecules aren't around. All it means is we get a lot of the end byproducts kicking around. So we got a lot of hydrogen, a lot of inorganic phosphate floating around the cell, and that's what ends up causing fatigue and decreased muscle force in regards to these shorter, high-intensity workouts, okay? So how can we adapt for that? I mean, that's one of the reasons why we're here, to learn how to train these systems through through exercise. But to understand the biochemistry of, say, when you're doing interval training work, what happens, what physically changes or physiologically changes in our bodies to help produce these training effects? Well, one of them is, and this is according to some studies, the activity of, say, creatine kinase increases. So what ends up happening is this creatine kinase is more readily available and able to regenerate ATP quicker. And this is kind of supported by other studies where at rest, if you do a lot of anaerobic training, we have higher concentrations of creatine phosphate as well as ATP in our bodies. And so even when we're not doing anything, we have this energy in our cells ready to go. So it's just a little higher volume energy, a little bit more readily available for us. And then ultimately, whether it's like the enzyme kinetics is called, or production capacity increases, or whether just having more of these enzymes and having more cellular level ATP kicking around, just waiting for us while we're at rest. If either of these are true, both would increase our ATP Pc capacity. Okay, cheers. Next up, we have glycolysis. So we've covered one anaerobic production of ATP. That'll be our next one. Cheers.